Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of developing a serverless Android application using Huawei's AppGallery Connect services. Last week, we got started with the cloud database setup. We got everything going and we sort of looked at some basic objects. This week, we are going to be looking at the cloud database service in more detail. We'll start by looking at how we can communicate between the app and the cloud and synchronize data, and how we might do that in real time to make sure that our local copy of the data is as up to date as possible. We'll then start making use of the service and see where we go with that, really. I think really that's the where we should get started. So without further ado, let's get into it and let's write some code. This is the cloud manager as we had it set up on the end of last week. The code for this is currently available on the GitHub already, so definitely go check that out. But we do have some more work to do here. So this was kind of the very basic setup of we want to be able to upsert information. We want to be able to delete users and query the users in the system. But I don't, in an actual application of this, we need to take it a little bit step further. So at the moment, this is slightly disjointed from, say, the UI and interacting with any output that we get back. At the moment in this process results, for example, we just have a comment saying, well, we've got our user list, do something with it. Now that's not actually all that useful because we are actually going to want to do something with it, and what we want to do with it is going to vary depending on the situation. So what we're going to do is we're going to flesh this out a little bit further. We've also got some cleanup to do. So previously we had actually started going down the route of defining cloud managers at this level and then passing it into the authentication manager. But I want to change that. I want to remove the cloud manager from these classes, from the main and the register, and specifically add it into the authentication manager, so that the authentication manager has its own instance irrelevant of where it's being used. So I think in the sake of sort of having a place to start, I think that is in fact where we will start. So let's basically go through and just remove this unnecessary code here. We're going to get rid of this as well, and we're going to change the declaration of this class as well. So we got rid of it there, and there. And over in the authentication manager, we are going to remove the cloud manager from there and remove that from there as well. And that should be this class cleaned up. Oh yeah, and we had that. We can get rid of. Cool. Okay, and over in the main activity, we're going to want to do the same thing again. So let's get rid of that. And we'll get rid of that. So it's not part of it anymore. And the same there as well. Excellent. Okay, so that should be... missed the line there as well. So we're getting rid of all that, and instead we are going to do the same thing essentially in here. So we do already have this database manager, but we are going to change that. We're going to make that private. I'm going to make that final. So one instance of the authentication manager, we can only have one instance of the database manager, which makes sense really. The two should be bound together quite closely. So in our constructor here, we are going to actually just create the instance. And the reason why we can do this quite easily is because we've already kind of set this up. All we were doing in there was doing this and then passing it through. So it was kind of not worthwhile. And then we need to have a look over what we've got here. So I think that's essentially all we have right now. The one thing we are then also going to do, of course, is when we come to use it, we need to make sure that it is, in fact, already been opened. So we're going to open it, and we're going to obviously use the same context that's already been passed through, like so. And that should then mean that when we go into using the authentication manager, we now have a database manager that's actually going to be usable, and we can start looking at, as we've done here, creating a user and then upserting it into the database. So I think that's all the initial changes that we need to do here that I'd like to do. But there's definitely a few more bits and pieces to be done as well. Now, probably the first thing we want to think about here is the fact that we do have some duplicate code. We're doing this here and we're doing that there. So we are going to extract a method to do that, and we can probably do that. I really should change it so it's capturing the whole screen, but we'll do it manually. So we're going to take that code there, and we're going to create a new private method, and that's going to be called I don't know, save registered user, and that's going to have a sign-in result like so, and that's then we're just going to be doing what we were doing there. So we can then, in the registrar class here, and we're also going to get rid of that because that's not really very useful right now. We're going to do just save register user with the sign-in result, and there we're getting rid of a bit duplicated code, so that's always a good thing. So even if it's irrelevant of whether it's phone number or email address, job done. Okay, so that's kind of the first change I wanted to make there, and I think that kind of sets us up quite nicely. So we need to now go back and think about how we're going to improve our on our cloud manager. Now, there's a few things here that we definitely can make better. One thing that sort of stuck in my mind after last week, probably the most obvious thing, is the fact that we're passing around an awful lot of contexts here. They're getting thrown around a lot, and that's not really necessary. It's kind of wasteful when really all we need to do is set a context as a private variable and make use of it. There's no need for us to keep passing it in. We set it once and then we go for it, and that's kind of all we need to do there. So let's start with improving our construct here. We are going to add in that actually we pass through a context at the time of construct, and that way we only define it once, and we haven't got to pass it through every single time. So we are this is a bit different because that's the initializing the whole system. The context is separate there, but we will remove it from everywhere else. Essentially, we just don't need that context there anymore because we have the context as a variable up here. So let's go through, let's get rid of the context, and that will clean things up a little bit. There'll obviously be some code changes that need to be made around that, but that should just clean things up and make it one less variable that's getting passed about, which is always a good thing. So for example, we don't need that anymore. We don't need it there. See, there's a lot of instances of this going on, which it's kind of pointless. There we go. There we go. That's looking in a bit of a better state. Of course, we also have it here where we are passing in the context when we say open the cloud database. So, well, instead we're actually going to put the context in there instead. So that's a bit better, isn't it? It works nicer, and we're only doing it once then. And we probably find that as well, yeah, when we upsert the user, we were passing in the context. We don't need to do that anymore. Context has been set, and we are very happy about that. So we can also set this to final, actually, because we are only ever going to set it once at the creation of an instance of this class. And after that, that's it. If we have a different context, we'll be creating a different instance, so we haven't got to worry. So that's the first change that kind of came to my mind between streams, shall we say. But now we want to think about a bit more about how we might actually use this code. And one of the things I think that's quite important to think about is how do we manage knowing what is the current maximum user ID. So if you remember last time, we talked about how the cloud database service doesn't have an auto increment function. So when you are creating new instances, new objects to be upserted into the database, it's down to you to manage the current maximum user ID and make sure that any new objects are given unused maximum user IDs, or, you know, assuming that's your unique primary key, which is how we're going to be handling it. So at the moment, our code, it only updates. We have this update max user ID, but that's only used when we get the result from a query and go through the list. So one way that we could handle this issue, obviously, is we could in fact use get all users, and we could request all the users from the cloud before we go ahead and actually handle any new user. So that's one way you could do it, but it's a little unnecessary. That's an extra call, an extra process that has to be run. It's a way that it's going to slow down your registration process, basically. So instead of doing that, what we want is a way to keep track of when there are updates to the cloud and capture those updates when they happen, and not worry about, and therefore not be worrying about times when there haven't been updates, and we can just leave that, we can ignore that. So for what we're doing right now, what we're doing is we're going to create what's called a snapshot listener. Now the idea of this is that we will periodically, the framework will check the cloud, will ask for a snapshot of the current data in the cloud, much the same as you do when you do a query. See, we get a snapshot, and then we get the users from the snapshot. So much in the same way as doing that, we're going to create a listener that's going to get a new snapshot whenever there's been a change to the data in the cloud. And that way we only process the data when we need to, and we can keep track of the current maximum user ID across devices in a serverless fashion. So we haven't got to worry about new users registering, because as soon as a new user is registered, the snapshot will be pushed out to all listeners currently listening. So we're going to start by creating that, and then we'll make use of it, and then we'll register it and make use of it, essentially. So back up here. The other thing that we're going to do at this point as well is we're going to keep a list of users in memory, just because that's something that we could potentially do. Well, do we do that? Do we keep a list of the current users in memory when we're doing this? I don't think we need to. I don't think in this current circumstance we need to worry about that. When we come on to using it in a feed structure, yes, we probably will. But right now we're not really interested in a list of users. There's no reason why when you're registering, you need to know what other users are on the system specifically. You only need to know if the user you're trying to register already exists and what the maximum user ID is, so that if a new user can be registered, you can give it a unique ID. So that's what we'll worry about right now. We're not going to worry about saving a list of current users, but it's something that we will end up seeing later on. So for now, we are going to create a new private on Snapshot Listener, and that's going to be a snapshot listener for the user object. You may have guessed that already. And we'll call that Snapshot Listener because we're nice and unique like that. And that's going to be a new on Snapshot Listener. We can actually change that into a Lambda function. That's fine. It's pretty. Actually, we'll do that in a minute. Let's think about this. So first, yeah, no, we can use a Lambda for this. That's easy enough. So this is our Lambda function. We actually talked about this on TikTok the other day. People were asking what a Lambda function is. So a Lambda function is essentially an anonymous function, and it's just a way of writing an anonymous method in a much more concise way. So for example, we know this snapshot listener is implementing an object that conforms to the on snapshot listener interface, and therefore we don't actually care what that's called. It doesn't need a name. It's only being used in this instance, and that on snapshot listener only has the one method. You can actually do it with multiple methods as well, but only has the one method. So a Lambda function can be used for that method, and we've basically got the two assumed inputs and then our output. So it just means you've got a lot less of lines of code, and it's arguably easier to read. Some might say it's not, but because of its conciseness, I quite like it. So anyway, with this on snapshot listener, we've been sent in a cloud database snapshot, and you might actually notice there's a similarity to this, where you can get our user snapshot list, our cursor, we can move through it, and we can do the same sort of stuff. So this code actually suddenly becomes the same, which I'm sure you may have guessed. What we're going to now do for now then is we are in fact going to just call this method. We're going to call this method process result, and we're going to let it run like that. So that's the sort of the most concise way of doing it, and we'll have that one method for now anyway to handle the process of that result, which all it's doing right now is updating the maximum user. We're creating a list locally just because, but we're not doing anything with it right now. Okay, so we've got that snapshot listener, but now we have to actually do something with that snapshot listener. It's not so much, we've defined it, but we haven't set up a subscription. We haven't said, give us the give us the updates for this particular object in the cloud. So we need to create a new method and get that written in. We've got closed database zone, so we're going to pop in here. Now there's a couple of methods actually. There's one method that I had kind of forgotten about last week. We would have got there if we then started to run the code. We would have seen that it would have failed. But the other method that we need is the create object type. And what this does is does the initialization on a cloud zone for the first time. So when you open a cloud zone, you kind of think about it like it's a blank database. There's no tables in that database right now. There's no information. There's no schema. So you have to once you've opened a database, you have to actually create your schema if it's not there. So this is where we can use, this will be in a try catch, and we'll be catching AGB CloudDB exception, yeah. And we will use our good old friend Mr. Toaster. Send an error message. Context low class message. So what we're going to do here basically is we're going to say with the cloud database that we have. So at this point, the cloud zone has been opened. So we now know, okay, well, that's where the data is being sent to. But at the moment, the table is empty. There's not even any tables. The database is empty. So we are going to create the objects, and we're going to use that helper class that we got sent with our information. And that's going to tell the system to create all the object types that are part of the get object type info. And that's our list of different object types that we have at the moment. We just have the user, but obviously we could have more in the future, and that will definitely happen. So this needs to be run before we actually open the zone for usage. So in here, we were up until now opening the zone, but this would actually fail, and it would give us an error along the lines of database, the database zone hasn't been initialized or something like that. I forget what the actual error message is. So we're going to first do the create object type method here, and that way we create it. Once that's done, we can then open, and we are good to go. Now, the other thing we haven't obviously used yet is the close, but we'll worry about that later. And that's the first method that we needed to add in, which I'd forgotten about. Now we can add our subscription to the listener that we just generated, the on-snapshot listener. So we're going to have a method called public void add subscription. And that's going to take basically a query and our subscription, our snapshot listener. And every time that query presents an updated result, it's going to send it to the snapshot listener, and we can do something with that to process it. So, for example, if we only are interested in keeping an eye on users that have been, users that are in a certain state, for example, or have a certain field that's been set, we can create a query specifically just for those users. We don't have to search against all users. And obviously, if you're dealing with a scalable system, you're going to want to have some sort of limitation on it. So, for example, your query in this instance, if we were just interested in the newest or the largest user ID, all we'd have to do is set up a query that returns the last entry in the database, returns the largest ID. And that way, you're kind of, it doesn't matter how many users you've got registered. You're not processing anything more. You've only got to worry about that bit largest one. And we'll probably look at doing that when we optimize it and start to make things a little bit more generic. Right now, we're going to keep it simple. And right now, we're just going to create the query. So it's cloud database zone query, and it's for the user object. And we'll call this just snapshot query. And it's just going to be, we'll use that helper one that we got before, which is the where clause, so where user.class. Nice, simple, straightforward. not too complex. We will look at more complex queries later. That I assure will happen. So the next thing we need to do is we need to register our listener with a handler. So let's just create a handler up here. We don't currently have one, so we're going to create one here, and that's going to be private listener handler, and we'll call it handler. It's fine. And where were we? We were down here, so we're going to do we are going to do handler equals cloud database zone. So specifically for that zone, subscribe for a snapshot, and we've got snapshot query. So what we're actually interested in getting updates about, our query policy, which we're only querying from the cloud. That's all we're interested in this instance. And then we need the actual snapshot listener. So like so, and that needs to be in a nice, no, we don't want to throw an extra, we want to try catch please and thank you. And there we go. And as always, we'll use the old coaster just to print out our error message on the UI. Cool. So this then basically is what's going to periodically check and say, yep, you know what, some other user in some other system has on some other phone has in fact registered, so the maximum user ID has increased. Here's your update, do something with it, in which case we increase our maximum user ID. Nice and easy. So where are we actually going to put that? Well, we are going to basically add this method into the process of opening the cloud. So we're going to say once we've opened the cloud zone, therefore we are now in a situation where we are ready to actually do stuff, we're also going to add the subscription. And that means that as soon as we've got everything open and set up, we're going to start listening for updates. It's kind of the best time to do it because you want to be getting those updates as soon as possible, because at this point we haven't actually queried the system at all. So as far as this, before this subscription, as far as the system is concerned, the maximum user ID is the default value, it's 0. But that probably isn't going to be the case. I mean, you know, it's going to be the case once when you've got no users and you're registering your first user. After that, it's always going to be some other number. So that's that all set up quite nicely. And now we need to think about, is there anything else that we need to do? Well, yes, there is actually. At the moment, we don't have any interaction back to the UI other than if we use our toaster. So for example, we want a way to know, has the user successfully been added to the system after they've been registered? What do we do once that has happened? Well, once that has happened, we're going to probably want to process some data and then probably display a different screen and give the user access to the app. So in order to do that, we're going to need to create a callback, a UI callback. Well, not necessarily a UI callback, but a callback, so that when something happens in this class, we can say execute this method on the callback, and that will have been registered with whatever class was the calling class. So you get this structure where you can kind of go back up, back down the hierarchy and push your messages back through to have some sort of processing. So what we'll do is we'll create a simple, very simple UI callback class. It's actually an interface, which we will make sure that any class that's using this database manager will extend. So we'll implement, sorry. So in our case, it will be the authentication manager. So let's just call this callback. We'll call it user callback for now, actually, as we are specifically doing stuff about users. And we're going to have 3 methods on that. So we're going to have on add or query, and we're going to send through a list of users, the list that we've got. We've then got on delete, because that's the other thing that we can do, and that's going to also give us a list of users, probably the list without the user that we, the list minus the deleted list user, but we'll worry about that. And finally, we should have some sort of way to pass through error handling. So because while we've got these toasts to say, look, here's the error to the user, the app doesn't know that there's been an error. So if the app is waiting for a user to register, it's going to get stuck. So we are going to have on error, and we'll just pass through a string for the error message for now. We don't need to worry about passing around the actual errors. It's more of a courtesy than anything else. So we've got that interface, and then we definitely need a instance of that in here so that we can trigger those methods. So we will add it in here, and that will be like so, and it's a user. Oh, I can't remember what I called it. User callback. Yep. User callback. We'll just hit callback, and that's actually what we're going to then do is we'll make that part of the initialization. So the other requirement up until now, the only requirement to use this was you need to pass in context. Well, we now actually want to say you also need to give us a callback. So we have some way that we know. Actually, I really don't like that that's lowercase, so let's just change that. So we need to have been passed in some object that implements that interface, and we'll call it callback. And then we can set up our callback here, equal that. Like so. That's obviously going to give us an error because the authentication manager isn't currently passing us that, nor is it implementing the callback, but that's fine. So at this point, what we can now do, say at the point where we've processed a result, we can now go, well, actually, we can fire that callback. So we can say callback dot on query or add, there's your user list, for example. And then the passed in callback, we can do something in the UI then. On the delete, we should probably also look at something along those lines. I mean, at the moment, not really an issue. And with the errors, well, where do we want to pass the errors? We probably want to do it here because that's where we're having the callback. So if that fails, we will have the on error instead. And we'll use the localized string as the message. So there we go. That's that all configured. And I think that is actually everything we might need in this class, at least, for the next part of this. So the next thing, obviously, is going to be to get this authentication manager implementing that callback, and actually then start using the code. Oh, hey! Right, so here we are. We're in our authentication manager, and we're now going to look, well, we obviously now need to provide a user callback. Well, we don't have one of those right now. So let's make this implement the cloud database CloudDB manager.user callback, like so. And of course, we'll need to implement the missing methods, which is fine, and they can be empty for now as well. That's also fine. But point is, we now can just say, well, look, we can actually just use this as the callback. So we're passing through ourself as the callback that then gets back using this. So you kind of get this sort of circular code going on. But that's the joy of objects. So now that we've got this, we are officially in a position where we can start using it. So we had written down here, save register user, where we create a new user, we get the maximum ID, and then we upsert it. And in fact, that should now just work. We should be in a good position where we can just do that. Now, of course, we're going to want to expand on this in a second, and that's kind of where we're going to go next. So next we're going to look at defining more objects and more information against the user and everything else. But let's just check to make sure that this works, shall we? That sort of big moment where we hope that what we've written will actually work. So let's see. Oh, okay, yeah. So you can even, of course. So in these instances, what Andrew Shue is yelling us at, because we're only calling another method. We don't even need to use a lambda. We can just use a method reference like this, and we can just say pass that through, and Bob's your uncle, which is probably even cleaner and is certainly easier to read than a lambda. So we're going to do that, and that way we know that, yeah, the on-success listener is actually just going to pass through its stuff into the save register user method. Simples. Because in these instances we're doing the same thing in more than one place. That's the easiest way to do it without any code duplication. So that's, I think, yeah, we are good to go. So let's hit the run, and what we're going to do is see if we can register a user, and then we'll check in the back end to see if that data is there. Bada bing. Go. Okay. There we go. So it's a bit happier now. So that's that launched. We're now just got to wait for the activation code to come through via email, which is what we looked at in the first live stream. And 551 716. We're going to log in, and as the toast says, the upsert has been successful. Now let's see if that's actually the case, shall we? So if we go back over to the web, we can now go into our cloud database. We're in the cloud database, and what we're going to have a look at is data entries, and we're going to select the Barker zone for the user object type. We're going to give that a search, and as if by magic, our user has turned up with the primary key of a1 and the UID of that very nicely long number. So we have a connection. It is working, which is brilliant. So I think that's a good place to come to an end for today. We've looked at how we can synchronize data. We've started to write some more detailed code around our cloud database manager, and I think our code's in a good place to wrap it up for today. Next week, we'll be looking at how we can start developing up our schema and start putting what we've learned to practice. So we'll start building out our app, start setting up a feed, and doing all that sort of fun stuff to move towards a Twitter clone. So that's everything for now. I'll see you guys next week. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed this tutorial, and to subscribe so you don't miss out on the rest of the series. We're also over on Twitch, streaming every week on Thursdays at 2 p.m. BST, and that's the kind of sneak peek of the work for that week. We'll be streaming it there first. We're also live on TikTok an hour before that at 1 p.m. BST, where we just have kind of like a pre-show. We hang out, ask questions. It's a good time if you've got any questions about this series to get them in and get a live response. And also live on Fridays on TikTok at 1 p.m. BST, where we just do a bit of an open office Q&A session about more general stuff. So if you've got any questions about developer advocacy, about coding, about Android, about Huawei, any questions at all, feel free to come along there and ask them there as well. But for now, that is everything. I'll see you guys next week. Have a good one.